Hey, Clayton, what's with all the crazy long ages in Genesis 5? Did people really live that long? This is a great question. We have some accounts early on in the book of Genesis. Maybe you remember when we were reading this in the fall, where there are these genealogies and there are these lists of people, and it says how old they were, and they're incredibly large numbers. Okay, so you got people who are living 300, 600, 900 years. It's a lot. You also have some people who are living something that seems a little more reasonable, but still pretty old. Okay, so you got some of our main characters, Abraham and the other patriarchs, who are living to be, 120 years old, or, just these very extended lifespans. And you look at that and you say, this seems a little unbelievable, right? And so what are we to make of these things? The problem with the ages is pretty straightforward, right? There's a question of science, right? How do you explain the biology of this thing? How does someone live that long? What happens to their body? What's different about their biology that they could live that long and we can't? That sort of thing. And then historically, it seems out of sync with what we know about ancient people, okay? We have bodies from ancient times, records from ancient times, and it sure seems like their lifespans are in the normal range that our lifespans are. In fact, they tended to live less long than us. They tended to be, I think the average mortality in certain ages back then was like 40 years old, So even then, an age like Abraham's would be strange, and certainly an age like Noah or Methuselah or one of these guys that lives hundreds and hundreds of years would be really out of sync. So how do we understand all of this, okay? The challenge with these numbers, these ages, is how do you understand the numbers? What are the numbers doing? And how do you understand it in the original context? Because there are different ways to use numbers when you're talking about something. I can kind of think of three big categories of how we use numbers. The first is measurement, okay? This is when you have a number that is fairly literal, okay? It's describing the size or the quantity or the duration of something, and it basically represents how you would measure it. Now, there's various levels of precision, do you round it off at a certain, ballpark kind of thing or that sort of thing, but more or less it's meant to represent, if you measured it, this would be, the number that you would get if you measured it. So it's literal, it's a measurement in that regard. The second way numbers are used is symbolically. Okay, so in our context, if you have 50 stars on a flag or you have 13 stripes on a flag, those numbers represent something, right? The reason you have 50 stars is because you have 50 states. And this happens a lot in the Bible, right? There are certain numbers that tend to be used in ways that are not quite as literal. They're more giving meaning to something, right? They represent something else. 7s, 12s, 40s, these sorts of numbers in the Bible tend to be symbolic. The third category of numbers is what you might call rhetorical or maybe artistic numbers. What we're doing is we're using them a little bit more like decoration to express more of a quality rather than a quantity. And you might say, when do we ever do that? Think of phrases like, there were 1 million cars on the road today, or I've got 10 cents to my name. I've told you 1,000 times to clean your room. It took me like 2 seconds to decide. I've been working 24/7 on this. Now, in those phrases, we know that those are not literal numbers. There were not literally 1 million cars on the road today. It's meant to convey the sense of how it was, the feeling of how it was. They're also not symbolic. The number 1 million could be replaced with 1 billion or thousands or something else, and it would still convey the feeling, the kind of force of what I'm trying to say. It's a little bit more like a color in a movie, right? Sometimes you have colors in scenes in movies that aren't meant to convey something in particular, but it gives you a vibe, right? Like a feeling, You see someone wearing red, and it might make them seem sultry or passionate or evil or something. It just gives you a feel to convey a sense of what you're talking about. Sometimes we use numbers like that. So in the book of Genesis, in these passages in particular, which is it? Is it literal, kind of a measurement? Is it symbolic? Or is it rhetorical, artistic? Is it kind of giving a flourish to things? So let's think about this. Could these numbers be literal? Could the ages, 600, 900 and something years, be literal? It could be. Those could be it. You'd have to do some explaining, and the Bible doesn't give us an explanation for this. Some people have said, well, maybe they lived longer because, in a sense, Eden was wearing off, right? Like Adam and Eve used to be in the garden, and they were eating from the tree of life, and so they were living forever. But since death came into the world, the effects of Eden, or the perfection of life before sin, was gradually going away, not immediately. Okay, so maybe Eden's just kind of wearing off, and their biology is catching up to the new state of things, or maybe the environment that they're in was different in some way. These are people who lived before Noah's flood, and so some people have said, what if the flood changed the environment in some way that caused them people to live less? They used to live longer, but something about the flood changed. That's an interesting idea, but it's pretty speculative. There's nothing in the story of the flood that tells us that this would be the case. Nothing that should make us think that kind of there's some dramatically strange environment before things that were changed after. It could be miraculous, right? God can keep people alive as long as He wants, and so it could be that God extended their lives in a supernatural way. You'd have to ask the question, why these people? There isn't something distinctive about these people that makes you say, well, God really would want to keep them around to bless them with long life. It doesn't seem to be the case for these super, super long things. So it might be literal, but it's hard to explain why or how that would work. It could be symbolic. And there are some people who look at the numbers that are there and say, these numbers are not random. Okay, this is hard to show without getting super into the weeds of the passages. But when you look at the actual numbers there, you realize that there are some patterns. There are some things where the numbers and kind of the last digit of the number and the size of the number and certain things, they couldn't be random. Like, they seem to have been crafted, designed. The distribution is wrong, if you want to put it in terms of probability. And some of the numbers actually add up to be other numbers. It seems like there's a relationship between different numbers in the text, that they're multiples of symbolic numbers, things like that. So people have said, well, it looks like there's some pattern to these sorts of things. But here's the problem. None of the patterns seem to come together in a really obvious way. Like something that is so obviously symbolic, like a 12 or a 40 or a 3 or a 7 or one of the numbers that we know is symbolic. So that if there is symbolism to this, if there's some sort of numerological meaning to this, it's lost on us. It would have been meaningful to the original audience, but we don't have the key to figure out what the symbolism is. So we don't know. So maybe there's symbolism, but we have no way of decoding it. But could it be rhetorical? Okay, this is the one that might seem weird to us, okay? In our society, we tend to take all numbers as literal, like those measurements. We default to assuming that if you use a number, you're describing some sort of measurement. And we don't usually use numbers in this rhetorical, artistic way. I gave the examples that sometimes we do, but we don't default to that. We assume that it's literal, if not. That isn't true in every culture, and that wasn't true in ancient cultures. We actually have examples of exactly this phenomenon where people are given exaggerated, large, over-the-top ages that people knew are not actually literal. Okay, so there are these ancient Near Eastern king lists. So you look at these kind of lists from Mesopotamia and different places where they list off the kings that ruled over them, and they will describe them as being 30, 40, 50,000 years old. There is a sequence of 8 kings in one of these lists that adds up to over 250,000 years of time. Now, their ages, obviously, were not that long, okay? And it is pretty clear that the people of that time did not think their kings actually lived for thousands and thousands of years. The reason they were doing this was to convey the grandeur, the extent, the kind of limitless nature of the power of these kings, that they were so grand, so amazing, that they were actually living all these super long ages. Now, in Genesis, it's not quite that exaggerated, but it is interesting to know that there is an example in ancient literature where people were described as having highly extended lifespans, even though you knew the audience was in on the joke, right? They knew our king didn't live 10,000 years. Our king was a normal human being. But if we want to honor the king, we describe in this way. So this could be what's going on with these kind of early people. You give them big, big ages as a way to say they were very important or they were the first or something like that. The challenge with this view is why these guys in particular. The majority of them are not very notable people, but there could be something going on where they're saying, this is where we came from. We came from this grand thing. It's hard to understand. I think the reality is I'm not sure we can know an exact answer definitively about those ages. Were they literal? Were they symbolic? Were they rhetorical? Could be a little bit of all of that. I don't know that we're going to definitively answer the question, what do we do with these ages? But I do think the big picture is clear. You'll notice that in the list, the ages are declining. Overall, they start big and they end up smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. This is what it's depicting. Death is winning. This is the tragic thing of life after Eden. What happened on the third page of the Bible? Human beings sinned, and because of that, we were kicked out of the presence of God and the source of our life. We were cut off from the giver of life. We talk about this all the time, right? And this is the way of depicting what happened to humanity after that. Death started to win. The curse started to overtake us. Generation after generation, we tried to outrun death, but death keeps taking us. This is a fact of our existence we cannot ignore. What hope do we have if there is not a rescuer? That's what those early chapters of Genesis are trying to do. They're trying to get us to say we are desperate because having been cut off from God, we now have no hope in ourselves. We are dying, and unless God intervenes, we cannot have life. That's what that's all about. Thanks for listening. If you've got your own questions, email questions@BibleSavvy.com. Like and subscribe to catch our regular episodes every Monday on the Bible Savvy Podcast.